Hi, everybody. Welcome. So glad you could make it today. And I am so excited because Standing for Truth is on my channel today. And we have a lot in common, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from him. So he's going to be joining in a minute. And I just want to welcome everybody who is watching now or maybe in the future and just say everybody is welcome here. I welcome people of all perspectives. And if you're an atheist and you're here, we're glad you're here. If you're a Christian and you don't believe in what we're talking about, that's okay too. We welcome you. And I hope you will just willing to hear another perspective. So welcome, SFT. I'm so excited that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a privilege, Rebecca. I've been looking forward to this all week. So thank you so much for having me on. This is awesome.
Cool. Me too. Well, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to know the Lord?
Definitely. First off, I did share this on my channel and Facebook page. So anybody from my channel or ministry in the chat, please like and subscribe. Rebecca, you're putting out great material. You're doing great work. So I want people to know that. And to your question, yeah, good question. So a little bit about myself. I grew up as a Catholic. I was never an atheist. That never really made any sense to me. Even in my college years, where I was more so agnostic to religion, I knew there was something off about Roman Catholicism, but I knew that atheism was just not defensible, I guess you could say. So that being said, I didn't get saved until sometime after college. And I eventually realized that Catholicism was not true Christianity, as you know. We could probably do an entire show on that, to be honest with you, on everything wrong with Catholic doctrine. But I eventually came to Christ and got saved. And, it was a long journey of watching debates, discussions, seminars, reading lots of books before I became a confident young earth creationist. So I started SFT a few years ago, actually, because I saw an incredible need for another strong young earth creation presence on YouTube. Because if you were around a few years ago, debates and discussions mostly occurred on atheist dominated channels. And I almost felt when there was a creationist or a Christian in there, it was oftentimes 3-on-1, 5-on-1, almost like a bully session, I found. So I felt there was a need to have more informed creationists willing to take on these atheists and evolutionists. So, I eventually learned how to join these debates and discussions and be able to utilize everything I had learned over the years of what I would say pretty intense study. And eventually I realized it would be beneficial to the community if I were to also host debates and discussions in a way that is fair to whoever the debaters are, whether it's an atheist and a Christian or just a theistic evolutionist and a young earth creationist. Although I'm young earth creationist, when I moderate, I want to be as neutral and fair as possible and kind of make these types of discussions edifying to the audience. So to this day, I think I've hosted and moderated over 100 plus debates. And I have also myself had roughly 100 of my own debates. So it's been a fun journey and quite the adventure, Rebecca.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and for whoever's watching right now, please do, if it's my audience and you haven't heard of Standing for Truth, go and subscribe to his channels, and he has Patreon. You can support him there. There's a list of links in my discussion section on this video where you can connect with his channels and website. So please do that. And there's people, and someone already put in a comment. Andrew put in a comment that, hey, this isn't really even an open question right now, whether or not, we all came from a common ancestor. So basically, the idea is out there that the majority of scientists, or even, all scientists, some people think, believe in evolution. Is that true?
Another good question. And no, it's not settled. And firstly, the most important thing to take from this, I debated an atheist by the name of Dr. Ron Garrett. Nice guy. He's been on my channel numerous times. And this was kind of one of his main arguments, that the majority of scientists believe in evolution. Therefore, it's not even a question worth considering, whether or not banana plants and whales really are related. But whether that is true or not, Rebecca, does not actually determine truth regarding whether or not the majority of people believe in something. The majority has oftentimes, as you know, been wrong all throughout history. As a matter of fact, if we go to Noah's flood in Genesis, that is amazing testimony to how the majority is usually wrong, because the majority during Noah's day was wrong in the same way that the majority is wrong today. I mean, only 8 people survived the global flood. And Noah had 100 years to build the ark, 100 years to preach, and still all we were left with was 8 surviving people. And sure, today we have naturalism dominating the thoughts of most scientists, right? But this is why they start their science with this basic presupposition, assuming naturalism, assuming materialism. They don't consider the supernatural. They don't start from the Bible. Most of these scientists believe the Bible is mythology or not real literal history, which we can get into a little bit later. But one thing to consider, Rebecca, is the fact that most working scientists went through all their many years of school without ever reading one young Earth creation technical paper. Most PhD scientists could not even iterate to you one basic young Earth creation argument or prediction. Young Earth creationists, PhDs, are making predictions in all fields of science. Astronomy, geology, genetics, biology. And that's the gold standard of science. And maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. So therefore, the answer is most scientists, they have been brought up with evolutionary science. Okay, so this isn't a big, massive conspiracy. It's because most scientists working in the secular fields, going to secular universities, they've never actually taken the time or even the opportunity to study young Earth creation literature. And one thing I'd like to point out too is that many Christians are PhD scientists. Many PhD scientists who are Christian will admit this, Rebecca. They'll admit that the Christian worldview motivates scientific discoveries. As Christians, right, as you and I, we understand that God upholds the universe, and therefore we should expect to find what in the universe? We should expect to find order. In the past, there have actually been numerous Christian scientists, and as a matter of fact, that was the norm. If you were a scientist, you were also a Christian, or at least you believed in God. This was almost just the obvious to scientists all throughout history. And many of the founding fathers, and I've actually got a list of them, but for sake of time, I won't go through them all, but many of the founding fathers of various branches of science were Christian. And it's only the Christian worldview that makes sense of science, right? Why does science work in the first place? Well, it's because the Bible tells us how the universe is. And from the biblical starting point, we know that the universe is upheld by the power of God. So from this starting point, and that's where I start, is from the Bible, we expect what? We expect to find order. We expect to find laws. We expect to find logic, patterns in nature. So according to the Christian worldview, the universe is upheld by a mind. And there is no way, if there's any atheists in the chat, there is no way to explain the laws of logic, the laws of nature, and so on without the Christian God. Would you agree with most of that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I agree. I don't see the universe coming into existence on its own or from nothing, as many people believe that everything happened by natural processes. So yeah, and there was a question in the chat about my perspective, and so the reason I'm excited for SFT to be on here today is because this is my perspective. I'm a young earth creationist. I have been for 20 years. And so I'm excited to have this perspective shared, because I've had a lot of people on my channel who have a different perspective. And I'm okay with that too. I'm okay with Christians, not believing what I believe about creation. But but SFT, regarding what you were saying about young earth creationist literature, Andrew Cummings says there is no YEC literature. What do you say about that?
Well, that's a common assertion as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, as somebody who's done, roughly 80 to 100 debates with many of them being with PhD scientists, from various secular fields, this is definitely a common assertion. But that's all it is an assertion, because creationists who have PhDs do real science. They have scientific models, which we can go through a little bit later as well. I've got plenty of slides to show you in the audience pertaining to the predictions that are coming out of these creationist models. These young earth creationist PhDs, they're making very specific testable predictions about what will happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And these predictions are tested and oftentimes confirmed. And this is the gold standard of science, right? To formulate a hypothesis, make testable predictions, and actually test them and confirm your model or rework the model. Mm-hmm. And we as creation scientists, we can do and make many testable predictions from the biblical starting point, starting from Genesis and taking Genesis as a literal historical account. And creation scientists do publish in the peer-reviewed literature. But remember, Rebecca, there is a bias, a huge bias against creationists in many, or actually most of the secular journals. It's precisely why there exists creation peer review. It's still peer review. And many of these biblical-based models and these biblical-based testable predictions go unchallenged. Mm-hmm. And it's the evolutionist side that are actually not meeting the gold standard of science, because they're being challenged by many of these creationist PhDs to make better and more superior testable predictions from their models, and they're not doing it. And we'll get into, I think, a little bit later as to some of the reasons why that is the case. But remember, when it comes to secular peer review, you can't question the bigger picture of universal common ancestry. You can't question naturalism or materialism. Now, you can question the details. You'll find a lot of debate, okay, in secular peer review regarding the details, but they're not questioning the bigger picture. When creationist scientists come along, what they are questioning is the bigger picture. Okay, so that's why, as I pointed out, there exists peer review. And peer review is good, as in you have peers who review your work, make recommendations, point out things. Hey, maybe this could be reworked, and then you go back to the drawing board and kind of rework that. But to have evolutionary based mindsets and people who hold to an evolutionary worldview and who automatically reject biblical creation to review your work, and because of their bias, it's going to be, for the most part, immediate rejection. So it's just false when they make that assertion. And people that make that assertion, they've probably never read a young earth creation technical paper. I spend a lot of time reading technical papers on both sides. And I'm here to tell you that the evolutionists, they're not meeting the gold standard of science. They're actually failing at the moment. So
now, Andrew says the PhD scientists you've talked to, SFT, are almost never in the field of study related to evolution. And actually, I before we get started talking about the evidence for young earth, I really wanted to talk about some evidence against evolution, because I do think there's, Andrew, I appreciate your perspective here, and I just want you to know that I am someone who I've read quite a lot from evolution believing scientists, and not even just not even listening to young Earth creationists, just by reading the scientists who write about their own field. You can see the problems with their worldview and with what they are presenting as scientific fact. You can just read these entire books and not see evidence for evolution, and yet they hold on to this belief. Right. So what is your experience with that, SFT? And can you share with us some of the strongest evidence against evolution?
Definitely. And to kind of comment on that first, before I get into some of the best evidence against evolution, and to also respond to what Andrew's saying. So if I share screen real quick,
sure,
Rebecca, because one thing that the evolutionists don't seem to comprehend is the fact that there are numerous technical papers in secular journals that creationists look to and can determine that this evidence actually goes against the evolutionary model and supports the creation model. For example, I've got countless papers here actually confirming predictions starting from the biblical creation model. So starting from our model, we would predict, obviously, that if God designed the original organisms, if God created Adam and Eve, for example, then we would expect in our genomes treasure and not junk. So for years and years, intelligent design advocates have looked to DNA sequences and elements that the evolutionists, they say, are either junk or genomic fossils, evolutionary leftovers from past common ancestors, okay? They have not predicted what would be understood as function, okay? But the creationists, we predict function, because if God designed Adam and Eve and the original created kinds, why would he design them with evolutionary leftovers and junk? If I were to design a car, then I'm not just going to have a car that mostly consists of 80 to 90% useless parts. Most of the parts are going to be there for a reason. So that being said, and this is just one line of evidence, we've got paper after paper in the secular journals. I've actually debated Andrew on numerous occasions, many discussions, and he rarely provides an answer to this. But as you can see, these papers go over incredible and essential functions found in DNA elements called retroviruses and retroviral-like elements. Right here, retroviral promoters in the human genome. Okay, so I could spend all day going into right here, regulatory activities of transposable elements from conflicts to benefits. So the point is that I'm trying to make, Rebecca, is the fact that it's oftentimes the secular peer-reviewed technical papers that's helping to confirm the creation model and refute the evolutionary model. Now, when you read through these papers, okay, so for example, here's from Science News. Scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses in immune response. This is exactly what we're predicting from the design starting point. When you read through these papers and you get to like the discussion portion or the conclusion, of course, these evolutionists with the evolutionary mindset, they're not going to tap out and say, well, this is kind of inconsistent with our model. No, they're going to come up with a story to kind of save the day, save the bigger picture. So oftentimes when it comes to these functional roles in these DNA elements that were once thought to be junk and useless, they'll say, well, these were co-opted, these incredibly functional and essential roles that are actually necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. They were co-opted at some point in the history of I guess evolution and common descent. But when you ask them to provide you empirical data for that, Rebecca, you won't get empirical data. They'll either say something like, well, it happened too long ago, or this is a rare occurrence. So that's the point, is I want to point out to the audience, evolutionist and creationist, when you read a secular technical paper, look at the data, but don't blindly believe the conclusions that are being made by the authors of that paper. Because if they're starting from the evolutionary worldview and the evolutionary starting point, they're going to do their best to fit the data in with the bigger picture that they believe to be true. Now, there are a couple other papers I want to go into, but I'm going to save that for a later portion of the discussion, showing that there's actually secular papers, Rebecca, that have overturned human evolution. We'll get into that later. It's some fascinating data. But within those papers, if you read the discussion and the conclusions, it's nothing but rescue devices, because they don't want to admit, okay, obviously this data is suggesting that humans and chimps aren't related. No, they're not going to admit that. Right. So they're going to say, well, maybe XYZ happened in order to explain the data. But that's where critical thinking comes into play. Someone like you and I, Rebecca, we can read these papers, we can look at the data, and we can see, wow, this is far more consistent with biblical creation. And that's one thing we're doing. This is the last thing I'll say on this, is we are, and I can speak for myself, we're reading technical papers from the evolutionist side and the creationist side. But the evolutionists say things like, well, creation peer review is not real peer review. So there's not real working scientists in the creation field. But that's why they're losing nearly every debate and discussion, because they're not staying up to date on both sides. Well, us as creationists, we are staying up to date on both sides. And oftentimes actually, Andrew said I never debate PhDs that are in the field. No, I've debated, for example, Dr. Stephen Frello's his name from a couple of years ago. He's actually a retired botanist, he's studied evolution for years and years and years. So I have debated people directly in the field, and they rarely have answers. So yeah, go ahead.
And I love that phrase that you used, and I don't know if you're the one who came up with this, but I hear you say it a lot, the rescue devices. And that is, whenever something doesn't fit their model, like you said, they come up with a rescue device. And like Nephilim Free says here, stories are always invented to fix problems with evolution or incorporate evidence of creation. Yeah, as if it were actually evidence of evolution. It's so pitiful. And that's exactly what I found is so true. It does not matter what the evidence shows. If the evidence does not fit their model, then they just come up with a story. And the more that you read, anything about evolution, you can easily see what is storytelling and like what the actual data shows. So like, it's something to pay attention to. If you're someone watching this and you really haven't looked into this much, then I recommend just becoming a critical reader of anything, every time you see a headline that says, oh, evolution discovery, whatever is the latest thing being promoted in popular science about, evolutionary discoveries, read it critically, because you're going to discover that they are just using storytelling, and that there's very little that is actually coming from data. And Andrew says he's not going to change anybody's mind here. He says he means no disrespect. He's just here to point out observations. And Andrew, yeah, you're not going to change my mind simply because I've been around too long. And I think, SFT has too, and some of the other people here, we've realized that it is storytelling. So, but let me get back to you.
No, that's good. That's great points. That's great. I completely agree. I love it. You know what? Let me share screen again, because I just have to show this. I brought a lot of slides. So for example, the topic of human evolution is a topic that I've studied intensely. And I've looked at both sides, and I've written numerous books on it. I'm actually currently finishing up a book on human evolution that I'm hoping to release in September. So I've actually dug deep into their own literature, looked at their own side, watched their own lectures, and they admit problem after problem, especially when their guard is down and they don't have young earth creationists in the back of their mind. And you listen to their lectures, you'll see that they're admitting to the bushy mess that is evolution, that is human evolution, that is. So, for example, here are a few recent articles that have come about. Like, here's a recent article that says, in groundbreaking find, 3 kinds of early humans unearthed living together in South Africa. So in other words, what they're finding is that there has been significant overlap. Okay, Rebecca, where they once assumed the Australopithecines, right? If you're familiar with Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, evolved into Homo habilis, evolved into, let's say, Homo erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens. Well, now we find 3 different early humans, Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and the earliest known Homo erectus, which we would say are human, appear to have lived at the same time in the same place. So the point is, from a biblical creation model, these types of findings fit beautifully well, because we would say, yes, there has been overlap, there has been significant coexistence, because we don't look to some type of linear story of human evolution from pre-human ape-like creatures to humans. Here is a recent article based on a technical paper where some of their best so-called examples of transitional forms, okay? One of them is called Australopithecus sediba, which they say is this perfect transition from ape-like creature to human. And what we find here is humans missing link fossils may be jumble of species. And this is a secular scientist admitting that, she concludes that the spines belong to 2 different species. Right here, the pair conclude that there are not 2, but 4 individuals in the remains of Malapa. So the point is, a lot of these best so-called transitional forms appear to be what's called artificial species. It's the accidental mixture of ape-like bones and human-like bones. And when you're actually looking at fossils, right, bones found in the dirt is essentially low quality data. You can't really get a whole lot from a bone found in the dirt. This oftentimes happens where you do get a mixture of different species. And they admit this in their own secular journals. And then oftentimes you can read articles based on that. So point is, the evolutionists will just rework their story, right? While us as biblical creationists, we constantly are looking at this data every single month almost. And it's helping to support our model. But then we've also got our own creationist journals where we're making predictions, and there's some amazing active research programs that some young earth creation scientists are doing, just confirming more and more of the biblical model. So it's actually kind of the best of both worlds. And the evolutionists refuse to look at both sides. And I think that's why they're actually failing. Look at this from a secular source. Gene mutations began showing up in the last 5,000 years of human evolution. I mean, the evolutionists are going to look at that and they're going to completely miss the fact that, well, that's kind of funny that the biblical model only goes back about 6,000 to 7,000 years, and gene mutations began showing up in the last 5,000 years. So, I mean, point is, I could go through paper after paper, Rebecca, showing from the secular side data that actually supports biblical creation. That if you're looking for a good laugh, go look at the story that they concoct to explain away the data, to ultimately fit it within that bigger picture that they can't question. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So now, what would you say to people who say that young earth creationists are just science deniers, like denying science in order to adhere to this literal interpretation of Genesis?
That's a good question, and definitely a common argument. I would say, actually, could you repeat that last part of the question about literal?
Like people who say that young earth creationists are just denying science in order to adhere to a literal interpretation of Genesis.
Right. Okay. Okay, so yeah, good question. Well, first off, we don't believe, as young Earth creationists, we don't believe in this straw man wooden literalism that many old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists accuse us of believing in. Okay, we actually believe in what's called a historical grammatical approach reading of Scripture. That's where we can acknowledge symbolism, metaphors, and imagery, but also understand the fact that when we read Genesis, okay, there is what's called, Rebecca, the frequent use of the Vav consecutive, okay? To break that down, when we read Genesis and it says, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened, okay, this is indicative of literal history, literal events that happened in the past. And as a matter of fact, when you go to Genesis 1 and look at the verses after verse 2, what you see is just that, a vav consecutive. Okay, and actually followed by a verb in the Hebrew word order that indicates a sequence of events. That's what we're looking at, is a sequence of events in Genesis. Therefore, this has to be read as a historical narrative, contrary to some of what I would say are compromising positions.
Mm-hmm.
No, the fact is, these events really took place, and there are well-known, well-studied Hebrew scholars that would agree this is the case. This has to be the case. And purely symbolic interpretations, they don't work. We also know that the genealogies take us right back to Adam, and from Adam to Jesus, right? Adam is the first Adam, Jesus is the last Adam, the second Adam. This is all real history that we are looking at. And I mean, we could talk all day as to all the reasons why Genesis 1 to 11 needs to be understood as literal history, has to be. Jesus and the New Testament authors viewed it as just that, as well as just this internal consistency of Genesis that demonstrates it has to be a historical nature. Peter, the Apostle Peter, refers back to the global flood event. We could talk all day why this local flood idea is just pretty nonsensical. So yeah, we aren't denying the fact that there can be moments of imagery and symbolism in Scripture. We just understand that when we look at this, we are looking at historical events. Now, when we start from the biblical starting point, we can actually make very specific predictions and retrodictions from the account that has been given to us by God, right? The special creation of Adam and Eve. We can look to the global flood. We can take the genealogies right back to Adam. Jesus Christ himself said, he made them male, and from the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. Well, we know genealogies only take us back 6,000 to 7,000 years. And we have Jesus Christ himself, our Lord and Savior, saying that the beginning of creation, not the beginning of the creation of Adam and Eve. No, the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. So that would have to then fit within that 6,000 to 7,000 years. Now, yeah, the context is talking about divorce because that's when marriage was instituted. They'll try and say, well, the context is divorce, is what they'll say. Yeah, of course, we have a beautiful kind of lesson there about how important marriage is. But Jesus is referring back to the creation of man, the creation of which occurred roughly at the creation of the universe. If the creation of man was day 6 and the 6 days are literal 24-hour days, then that makes sense. That's still the beginning, right? If I say, the first thing I did in the morning was drank a coffee. Well, that doesn't have to literally be the first thing I did. I mean, when I first got up, maybe I checked my phone, went to the washroom. Okay, all those events within the first hour of my day can really technically be considered the start of my day. So day 6, creation of Adam and Eve, would technically be the beginning of creation. The old earthers, theistic evolutionists, they have a huge problem with that. So I guess my final response to your question, and then we can get into some of the lines of evidence. The scientific data actually confirms Genesis. When you take Genesis as literal history, the scientific data is corroborated by that. So we have no reason then to force fit a theory such as universal common ancestry into Genesis where it doesn't belong. Why would we ruin the Bible with a garbage so-called theory that lacks evidence anyway? So
Right. Well, Pine Creek has asked, and I think you've actually just been answering this question, but what is the creationist model of creating life? And so I think you've really kind of answered that, right? Is there anything you want to add to that?
What is the creationist model of creating life? Well, starting from the Genesis account, we have, see, here's the thing, as young earth creationists, we can derive many different models from the Genesis starting point. I think the dominating model currently in creationist circles is this idea based on the Genesis starting point. God said, what? Be fruitful and multiply. Okay. So if he said be fruitful and multiply to Adam and Eve, when we actually take this to the genetics realm, Rebecca, then we would assume that God would have created Adam and Eve, which would apply to the biblical kinds, this would apply universally, with what's called DNA differences, because that would allow Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, but also not make clones. God didn't say, be fruitful and clone yourself. So it would make sense that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve with created DNA differences. So is this true? Or is this just ad hoc? We just making this up? Well, we can then make predictions. Okay, if this is the case, then we should expect the vast majority of our genetic sequences, genetic elements, as I was talking about earlier, they should be functional. They should be essential. They should reflect that initial created event. Now, we like to use fancy words like heterozygosity. That just means a state of DNA diversity. Adam and Eve and the biblical kinds were created in a state of DNA diversity where from that starting point, they could change, they could adapt, they could, essentially not produce clones. So the point is, and earlier, Rebecca, I showed numerous papers demonstrating just that, demonstrating the amazing functionality of our genome. I mean, it was the ENCODE project that revealed, this was a secular project. They revealed that the vast majority of our genome is active. Over 80% of our genome is active. So creationist scientists are actually making testable predictions saying, okay, if we were to knock out this genetic sequence, or if we were to look at this DNA element, it would be functional in this role, and so on and so forth. I mean, we talk all day about testable predictions, and these predictions are actually being confirmed more and more every day. Now, obviously, we would reject abiogenesis. And in one of my books behind me, actually, I cover many reasons why abiogenesis just needs to be rejected. It's been nothing but a massive failure, chicken and egg problem after chicken and egg problem. Everything had to be created very good, as the Bible says. It could not have come about from inadequacy to precision. Protocell to, fully working complicated cell. I mean, one single cell is more complicated than the smartphones we have, or more complicated than the space shuttle. And we've got, 100 trillion cells in our body. So no, these systems, oftentimes irreducibly complex, had to have been created that way, fully working and in place right from the beginning. So that's kind of a working model right now that creationists are looking into, and it's pretty fascinating because every day we're coming out with findings that confirm that starting point. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, so do you want to get into sharing some of the evidence that the evidence for young Earth?
Definitely. But there is one thing I want to say. I kind of want to backtrack, Rebecca, because I was taking notes on some of your initial questions. And one of your question was near the beginning, and I think we went on some rabbit trails because there are so many good points you could talk about, right? You mentioned that oftentimes the evolutionists will say there's just overwhelming scientific evidence for evolution, right?
Right.
And you asked what is the truth about that, and I want to make it clear, especially for anybody in the audience who's maybe new to this debate. You will commonly hear this is what I heard all throughout college, but the first thing you want to do, you want to stop whoever's saying that. Okay, you want to stop them right there when they say, well, there's just so much evidence for evolution. The first thing you want to do is ask them, well, what do you mean by evolution, right? Because depending on what you mean by the word evolution, I may or may not agree with you. As in, if by evolution you mean changes in allele frequencies. Allele just means, a genetic variant, and we can have different frequencies of different genes in populations of organisms, or just change over time, or adaptation to environments, or let's say variations within the same kind of creatures, right? For example, we have been able to, as humans, artificially select for many different breeds of dogs. I think there's about 450 different breeds of dogs right now. Different breeds of horses. I think there's roughly 700 breeds of horses. And cats. This is all humans artificially selecting for certain traits and genes that have been able to produce this type of variation in human history. Obviously, even the evolutionists would have to agree with that. So the point that I'm trying to make, Rebecca, is that nobody disagrees with variation and change. And I always say, with ever-changing environments, organisms would then require ever-changing genomes. It makes sense from the biblical starting point that God would give creatures the ability to change. This is smart forward thinking, which points us back to what? A forward thinker, which the evolutionists or the atheists typically want to deny. When they deny the forward thinker, I want to point out, Rebecca, they're actually giving evolutionary processes like natural selection and mutations a mind. Okay, but natural selection and mutations, they don't have a mind. Natural selection actually sees the short term. For the audience sake, natural selection is really just a fine-tuning mechanism to keep a species as strong as they can be. It doesn't create anything new. And mutations typically cause damage, because they'll say natural selection is going to act upon mutations, which are the result of the genetic variation. But this is negative variation. The type of variation you get from mutations, Rebecca, is the type of variation you get on your car when you park at the grocery store and somebody smacks it with a grocery cart, right? Dents, scratches, rust marks. That's the type of variation you get from mutations. So not very helpful, pretty useless, actually. So the point is, if that's what they mean by evolution, which they don't usually mean that, right? Then we would agree with them.
So then they would say, if you're okay with change, if you think change happens, then, why can't these changes add up to be large changes within the organism?
Right. Good point. Good question. So that would bring us then to exactly what they would say is this type of large scale evolution that says banana plants and whales are related. Okay. All life, including plants and animals, descend from ultimately a single common ancestor in the past, something like a single celled organism. Which essentially came from lifeless chemicals. So they'll say, yeah, these changes, then these microevolutionary variations that we see can add up to bigger changes, right? Take your fish to fisherman, take your bacteria to a biologist, pond scum to people. But here's the thing, is the type of changes we're getting, Rebecca, it's not what I would call vertical type changes. It's actually horizontal changes. They're downhill changes for the most part. When we see a wolf to a chihuahua, there's been a lot of information lost. There's been a reduction in what's called heterozygosity. Like we were explaining earlier, heterozygosity means a state of DNA diversity. But then you've also got homozygosity, which means a state of no DNA diversity. And that's pretty much what you get with these changes, is you are going downhill. So you're never actually going to get pond scum to turn into people or fish to evolve into fishermen through generations of losing information or damaging the genome. Because typically these mutations are actually functionally compromising two organisms. You can't take two chihuahuas and over generations breed eventually a wolf. But you could technically take, two wolves or two generic dogs, and there would be enough information in their genomes to select for every single breed that we see today. So yeah, you hit walls, you hit barriers. There's only so much change you can have, and that change is typically reductive. Okay, what we actually see is called reductive evolution. We don't see large scale evolution. It's not even possible. It's not the type of change that we see. Does that kind of make sense, Rebecca?
Yeah, absolutely. Digital Gnosis says if there's the same number of alleles and the same number of allele differences, then the information content in the DNA is exactly the same.
If there's the same number of alleles and the same number of allele differences, then the information content in the DNA is exactly the same. If we were to compare, let's say, humans and chimpanzees or humans and dogs, and we were to look at the percent differences, okay, we were to look at those DNA differences. Let's take our closest so-called common ancestor, humans and chimpanzees. What they actually know when they sequence the parts of the genome that aren't just expected to be similar, but they actually consider things like gaps, copy number variations, okay? Because there's huge chunks of either genome that are missing that you can't find in chimpanzees or humans. So when you consider all these things, there's actually about 400 million DNA differences separating humans and chimpanzees. So with those differences, okay, as Digital Gnosis is pointing out in, let's say, alleles, then you would need, according to the evolutionary model, humans and chimpanzees split from a common ancestor about 6 million years ago. And then you've got the human line one way and the chimpanzee line another way. You'd have to actually fix, and fix just means to be stuck in place, okay? You'd have to get stuck into place all these DNA differences. But there's what's called a waiting time problem, because to fixate new mutations, it's called, takes a long time. In a population of 7 billion, there's almost no fixation, because if I pass on a mutation to my daughter, my wife and I pass on a mutation to, say, my daughter or son, eventually that's probably just going to get lost down the road. It's not actually going to fixate in the human population. So hope that kind of makes sense to the audience. But even just a few 100 million DNA differences that separate some of these biological organisms, it's too much. Evolutionists can't account for it. There's not enough time. They would need more time than they even say the universe existed to fixate that many DNA differences. So yeah, that's no help to the evolutionists. So it's not a problem to us, though, Rebecca, because remember, from our starting point, we are saying that God front-loaded most of these DNA differences into, say, Adam and Eve. So if they were there from the start, then there's no waiting time problem. They were there. And that's actually, we see evidence for that, because we see evidence for genome-wide functionality. So I'm trying to, a lot of this can be technical. I'm trying to kind of break it down. But yeah, good question.
Cool. So what did you want to share with us about, like, more evidence for young Earth creation?
Okay. So good question. Yeah, I definitely wanted to get that out of the way, that when people say, you know, there's a lot of evidence for evolution, make sure you ask what they mean by evolution, because change, yes, banana plants and whales related, no. So when it comes to evidence for, say, young Earth creation, oh man, we could be here for the next 3 hours. So I better take a sip of water. But there is, you can go into any field, really. And my main focus is genetics. Genetics actually puts shelf lives on genomes, Rebecca. So what I mean by that is we have mutations accumulating every single generation. And since we now know most mutations are damaging, one single point mutation can kill an organism. One single point mutation can cause a disease that's not going to result in reproduction. And that's it. That's the end of that line. But they're trying to say these mutations drove a fish to fisherman, okay? Single-celled like organism into humans and whales and whatever. So it's just not possible, because now we know living organisms are actually devolving. These mutations accumulate. The human mutation rate's about 100 new mutations per person per generation. So we can take this point of, let's say, most accumulating genetic load, okay? And we could take this back to a point of least accumulating genetic load. That would only be a point about 6,000 years ago with Adam and Eve, where they were created with no mutations. And that's what I mean by mutation accumulation puts shelf lives on genomes. We actually see in the fossil record, you can go back a few 100 million years and you can find organisms that haven't changed at all. So according to the evolutionists, there's been what's called stasis. Take a horseshoe crab or a coelacanth or something like that. Very little change in hundreds of millions of years. No, what we know about mutation accumulation, that's not possible. They'd be extinct. How can they have survived for millions and millions of years and also managed to filter out all these mutations? So that's one line of evidence. Does that kind of make sense, that these mutations limit the lifespans of organisms and species?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Well, what about what, Digital Gnosis has a lot of good questions in the chat, but he asks, can mutations ever be good?
Good question. So beneficial mutations would be what he's referring to. There's been a study, the long-term Lenski experiment, the longest running evolutionary experiment, thousands and thousands of generations of bacteria. And what they're doing is they're looking for these types of beneficial mutations, good mutations. They have discovered that a good mutation is roughly 1 in a million mutations. And when you even get that 1 in a million, Rebecca, they're typically reductive, as in order to have an advantage, they're losing genes. Like bacteria are known to lose genes short term just to improve and adapt to an environment, but it's actually long-term degeneration because you keep losing genes. This results in what's called a shrinking functional genome size. And to make it understandable to the audience, let's take our car and let's say for the time being, I want to get better gas mileage. So what do? We're going to remove weight from the car. Okay. So we're going to remove the doors. We're going to remove the back seat. We're going to remove the side mirrors, whatever, you name it. We just start removing weight. Okay. Temporarily, we've improved gas mileage. But overall, we're degenerating the car. I mean, we're removing weight. We're not making things better. And that's what you see is, yes, you can find mutations that are beneficial, okay? But oftentimes it's at the expense of genes. It's functionally compromising to the organism. Sickle cell anemia is a disease. It's a deformation in blood cells, okay? But people with sickle cell anemia are more resistant to malaria. Well, malaria is a disease that's bad. Sickle cell anemia is a disease that's bad. You don't want either. But if you get the sickle cell gene, the sickle cell mutant, okay, you're less prone now to get malaria. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't want sickle cell anemia or malaria, but there is a possible advantage to be had due to a deformed hemoglobin molecule. So yeah, if by good you mean overall damaging. And here's the thing, Rebecca, here's the last thing I'll say to that, because that is a good technical question. We know most mutations are bad. We know mutations are accumulating from generation to generation. So the evolutionary biologists will say, well, the beneficial mutations will counterbalance the damage. But what we're seeing here, Rebecca, is that good mutations are rare, 1 in a million. Typically, when we get that good mutation, it's still reductive. It's still damaging in some way. But even if we give it to them, let's just say, sure, you can have that 1 in a million mutation. Let's just say it's good. It's just absolutely beneficial, no harm. It doesn't matter because now we have one beneficial mutation out of a million that are bad. So that one good mutation is just going to get diluted down. It's not going to counterbalance the damage, is what I'm trying to say. It's like, think of an encyclopedia, okay? And one single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia, on its own, it's inconsequential. But over time, they build up. And maybe one day you get a spelling mistake that just turned out to make that one word better. Ooh, that's not going to counterbalance all the other spelling mistakes. So you can even just give it to them. Yeah, sure, have 5 beneficial mutations, have 10, have 20. It's not going to help the case because organisms are still degenerating because it's a net loss. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want us to believe that we all, evolved from a common ancestor, then this needs to be shown to be able to happen. I mean, if we're calling it science, it should be based on observation, not based on storytelling. But, we don't observe animals as systems and becoming like, we don't observe them coming into existence. And if all we observe is small changes in organisms that don't result in new systems, then how can we call this evolutionary story science? That is not science. That is it's an idea. It's one idea about how things came to be, but you can't call it scientific if it's not based on observation and experiment. And this is just something we haven't observed.
Great points. Great points. One thing that I'll say too is, for sake of time, I'm not going to show, but I could. So I've had many debates on this topic, genetic entropy, and the objections that will be put forth, Rebecca, is, well, this is just a young Earth creation invention. This isn't real. Well, there are countless secular papers out there from evolutionary population geneticists that are actually admitting everything that I'm saying. As in, they're the first ones to recognize, most mutations are actually effectively neutral, as in they only have slight effects on fitness. How are we going to solve this? Or humans seem to be devolving. We've got the rise of these diseases, cancer rates are skyrocketing. Autism seems to have a genetic component. We've got environmental related mutations as well, which is called epigenetics. We've got the rise of immunological disorders. I mean, it's not looking too good for the human population. I mean, we are all multiply mutant, So the next time when people say, SFT, you're not looking too good today, you're looking a little tired, I say, yeah, because today's the most mutant that I've ever been. Every single day we acquire more and more mutations in obviously our somatic cell lines, and then we end up passing some of those on from generation to generation. So we have 7 billion people on the planet, Rebecca, and every single person has mutations that they've accumulated from past generations. So for selection to ever solve this, a selection would have to remove every single human being on this planet. What would that result in? Immediate extinction. Or selection can remove the worst. Let's take 50% of the worst mutants on the planet. Remove them. Is that going to make things better? No, because then you're left with roughly 4 billion people who are still more mutant than the generation before it. So the point I'm trying to make here is, any rescue device that they put forth, you can actually just give them the benefit of the doubt and say, fine, just remove the worst mutants. It ain't going to solve the problem. And this is exactly what we'd expect from the Genesis starting point, where in Genesis we read of the biblical patriarchs lived into their 100 years, 200 years, 900 years, right? How is this possible? And then after the flood, there's this significant drop off. Well, after the flood, we have massive changes in the environment, but we also know as mutations accumulate, that decreases our ability to live longer lives. And there's this perfect decay curve, actually, if you plot it out, where to deny it is to say that the early biblical authors fabricated this data that would require advanced knowledge in biology and mathematics to just make up this perfect biological decay curve. So I don't know, I could talk about it all day, but that's just one line of evidence that really, really corroborates the Genesis account of longer lives and better health.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, when we look at the world and the population, and we look at like the population growth, basically it goes down to zero in the thousands of years ago, not millions. And so, where are all the people? If we've been, even a couple 100,000 years of humans procreating, then where are all the people right now? And when you look at what the evolutionists say about it, they say, oh, well, for hundreds of thousands of years, our population growth was 0.0000000. And it goes on and on. And like, so it gets ridiculous, because even if, for 100,000 years of procreating, even if you killed off 99% through disease and other and war or whatever, then still we should have way more humans alive today than
Amen.
What we have.
This also goes for the fossil record. Okay, take one so-called hominid, take Erectus, who supposedly lived on the planet for millions and millions of years. Did you know every single Homo erectus fossil can be fit in the back of a trunk? Even the evolutionists would agree that Homo erectus was a pretty sophisticated people. Now, they'll say a pre-human people, but they'll admit that they had purposeful navigation. They built campsites, campfire. Okay, if their generation time was roughly the same of ours, you can calculate that. We should have, millions to billions of dead bodies if erectus lived on this globe for millions of years, like they say. Where's all the evidence for their existence? Why can you fit every single Homo erectus fossil in the back of a car? They can find a finger bone or a pinky bone, and they can tell you what that fossil specimen, what their family looked like. I mean, the stories that they build from one single bone. I'm going to share a screen real quick just for anybody in the audience, Rebecca, to make this kind of as thorough as possible. And if anybody wants to email me or, they're interested in these slides and this data, I'm happy to share it. So I like to leave no stone unturned, especially if there's skeptics in the audience. Everything I'm saying is backed up. If you don't like young earth creationist technical work, well, you're limiting yourself for one. You're not going to go too far in the debate world. But everything I'm saying is also confirmed in the secular research, in secular research papers. Michael Lynch, well known, well-respected population geneticist. An average newborn contains 100 de novo. That means new mutations that were not previously there. That's exactly what I was saying. Right here, slightly deleterious mutations. This is Kimura. This is a paper I highly recommend, where he talks about, under the present model, effectively neutral, but in fact, very slightly deleterious mutants accumulate continuously in every species. The rate of loss of fitness per generation may amount to 10 to 7 per generation. So you can read through all these. Dr. John Sanford, he's actually a young earth creationist, but his work in genetics, okay, he was an evolutionist for, I think, about 50 years till he converted. He invented the gene gun, well-respected geneticist. He converted to young earth creation when he realized that this mutation accumulation problem, Rebecca, it's unsolvable. There's no answers. And every rescue device that has been put forth, and I could go through them all, for sake of time, I won't, but they've all been looked at. They've actually all been looked at in numerical simulation experiments, and they've all been falsified. For example, here's a number of papers. Anyone's interested, of course, they can email me anytime, but they've all been validated in the fact that mutations accumulate, they degenerate, and there's no way to stop the degeneration process. So selection can slow it down a little bit, but that's about it. It can't stop it. Here's what I was talking about earlier, Rebecca, with the lifespans, this exponential decrease. If you plot it out yourself from Adam to Seth down to Noah post-flood, you see this exponential decay curve that maps out perfectly with mutation accumulation. And that's what I mean by you can take this back to a point of least mutation accumulation. That would be a point of what? Our early biblical patriarchs that lived and had longer lives. So here's the coefficient p-value of this being made up, Rebecca. Less than 1 chance in a quadrillion. So the theistic evolutionists or the atheists that want to deny this and say this is all just a coincidence, I mean, that is one big chance. So, I mean, there's a ton of amazing data that confirms biblical creation. There's one thing here, and I've got 1,000 slides, so sometimes it's difficult. But for example, here we have paper after paper showing that our last common ancestor, mitochondrial Eve, okay, according to our model, that would be Eve, who was created with Adam, okay? This article also noted that the new findings of faster mutation rates pointed to mitochondrial Eve about 6,000 years ago have been contributed to the development of new mitochondrial DNA research guidelines used in the forensic investigations adopted by the FBI. So the point is, these are findings in secular research papers. Now, the evolutionists obviously aren't going to tap out and say, oh, wow, every single human being today descended from, mitochondrial Eve, the biblical Eve 6,000 years ago. They're not going to admit to that. So what they do is they calibrate the data with the geological column, okay? And to make a long story short, they're assuming deep time evolution. And what they're actually getting is a much slower mutation rate than we see today. And you can actually map out, I think I have them here. So these are called phylogenetic trees. This gets a little technical, so I'm just going to break it down easily. You can map out the genetic differences in people groups worldwide. Okay, this is a mitochondrial DNA phylogeny. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited specifically on the mother's side. Y chromosome specifically inherited on the father's side. These are called our uniparentally inherited DNA compartments. Okay, one compartment inherited from our dads, the other from our mothers. But what's amazing is we have actually discovered Adam and Eve, more specifically Noah. Noah would be our last Y chromosomal ancestor. We've discovered them in our genetics. And these trees are confusing, but what I'll say is there's not a lot of DNA differences here. There's not a lot of variation. All of these DNA differences can easily be accounted for in just 6,000 years. And the evolutionists, and if there's any evolutionists in the chat, I challenge them. There's no way that they can explain away this data. You got a fast mutation rate, Rebecca, and you've got only a few DNA differences. So the only way you can have a fast mutation rate, and yet all of our mitochondrial DNA and every single male Y chromosome is nearly identical, is because we all descended from ancestors, a Y chromosomal ancestor and a mitochondrial DNA ancestor, just between 4,500 and 6,000 years ago. That's the only way to explain this data. So this confirms, the biblical model and the biblical starting point of Adam, Eve, and then eventually a bottleneck at the flood, where Earth was repopulated by three founding couples. Noah's. Yeah.
Now Ken has a question. He says, what about the Americas? We have dates farther than 7,000 years. How did that happen?
Good question. So I'd recommend, I wish I could find it here, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen. Okay, so this is, let me see. He has, okay, here they are. So here's a technical paper from Dr. Nathaniel Jensen. Evidence for a human Y chromosome molecular clock pedigree-based mutation rate suggests a 4,500-year history for human paternal inheritance. So Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, a Harvard graduate, by the way, he took this data and he's now working, he has an active research program to see, okay, does all of human history actually fit within 4,500 years since the flood? Because we should then be able to detect genetic signatures in terms of the history of civilization, if that makes sense. We should be able to find genetic signatures and markers for, the migration into the Americas, or the Roman Empire, Genghis Khan's conquest, the Persian Empire. All these things has to fit within those 4,500 years. So he has come out with subsequent papers. Here's one that I highly recommend everybody reads. Testing the prediction of the young Earth Y chromosome molecular clock population growth curves confirm the recent origin of human Y chromosome differences. So he's actually shown that all these events, all these migration events that the evolutionists and secularists say occurred far beyond the 6,000 year time that we have from the Bible, has actually been refuted. And there's highly technical work showing this. Essentially, Rebecca, what they do is they assume population sizes, they assume archaeology, and they assume the geological column. Because remember, they assume the bigger picture, that evolution happened, that humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor. But we've got young Earth creationist PhDs that are going in and not assuming that. And what we are getting is confirmation of 4,500 years worth of time where we can fit the entirety of human civilization in that time period. And I will say this data hasn't been refuted. And I challenge anybody in the chat. He actually has a recent paper specifically on that. Was it the Americas was his question?
Yeah, it was about, let me find it again. It was,
I think it was
back here pretty far. Yeah. So What about the Americas? Yeah. And I'm imagining he's talking about just like archaeological evidence that we have that people were living at that time.
It's circular. So they're assuming archaeology, and then they're fitting in. If they're using genetics, they're first going to assume archaeology and dates derived that way. And I guess that's where we can get into these dating methods, if you'd like to, and how problematic the dates are. If you had a couple comments, I do have that you wanted to make. I want to find a chart that I put together.
Sure.
To show how invalid these dating methods are.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I'll just say in response to some of the people in the chat who are just kind of calling this insanity. So, like, there are scientists, like we were just looking at Dr. Jeanson's work. And, so this isn't just coming out of, some like crazy person who made this up. There are scientists, good scientists, credentialed scientists who do not believe that evolution is scientifically viable, that they believe that the evidence does not support it. And so I just challenge those who are really being critical. Have you examined the evidence yourself? Or are you just like going on the basis of what you've been taught for your entire life almost? I mean, from the time that we're 5 years old, most of us have been indoctrinated with these ideas. And that's the way it is for most scientists. Most scientists got indoctrinated into these ideas very early on, and they never questioned them. And most scientists aren't even working in the field of evolution. So whether or not they believe in it does not necessarily mean that the evidence supports it, if that makes any sense. Anyway.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And if I could add too, as you've seen, I've shown numerous papers where this 6,000 year date for Eve came from secular papers. One of the most famous one is the Parsons paper, where they realized, wow, the mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA is way faster than we thought. So when we actually account for the faster mutation rate and then also the number of DNA differences that separate any two people on the planet, Eve would have lived 6,000 years ago. That's not young Earth creationists making that up. That's secular scientists coming up with this data through empirical science. But then when you read the papers, they calibrate it because that's where the assumptions come. And that's why I want to emphasize this is where critical thinking comes into play. From a biblical starting point, we don't need to calibrate these dates. We don't need to come up with rescue devices. It fits nicely. We have a fast mutation rate. There's low genetic variation. And there's actually, I'll say this. This came as a shock, Rebecca, that every single human being is 99.999% similar. There's incredibly low genetic variation in the human population. We're pretty much the same. We have low genetic diversity, okay? This was a shock because if evolution was true, and I'll try and break this down, if we've been evolving for millions of years, okay, we've evolved from the Australopithecines up to Homo habilis, up to Homo erectus, who lived on the planet and shared most of the globe for millions of years, which eventually evolved into Homo sapiens, and Homo sapiens left Africa and spread out in all parts of the world. Well, that's millions of years of mutation accumulation, and mutations, according to the evolutionists, adds genetic diversity every single generation. So humans, we should have had high levels of genetic diversity. Okay, so this was a shock. Now, from our starting point, Rebecca, God created Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago. Okay, that really restricts genetic diversity. So from the biblical starting point, that makes sense. We are all 99.999% similar with low genetic diversity because we descended from Adam and Eve just 6,000 years ago. That makes sense. So the evolutionists, instead of tapping out and saying, wow, this is this is a big problem for our model, they invented a rescue device called the out of Africa population bottleneck. Now, it's really hard to find an exact date. Some say this happened millions of years ago with Homo erectus. Some say it happened 70,000 years ago. Some say 200,000 years ago. They don't really know. because there's no data to support it. So it's just contradictory. So they'll say there was this massive, massive near extinction event where the human population at the time shrank to between 2 and 10,000 people. And there were about 2 to 10,000 people on the globe, well, in Africa, for 1,000 years, 100,000 years. They don't really know. As much time that would be needed to restrict genetic diversity, because they would look to inbreeding. If you have 2 to 10,000 people, all for the most part living in the same area, they're inbreeding. Inbreeding, for one, results in disease, but inbreeding does reduce levels of genetic diversity. So they'll look to this in order to explain the data, why we have such low genetic diversity. But here's the thing, they didn't predict this. They didn't expect this. They were shocked. So they invented a story. And this story doesn't even work. Because Rebecca, if you're inbreeding for thousands of years and you've got all these deleterious mutations coming to the forefront, leading to disease and genetic degeneration, that's going to result in accelerated extinction of these people. But they want us to believe that this people suddenly left Africa, exploded into all parts of the world, and eventually seized dominion over the planet and invented the space shuttle and smartphones and these laptops we're talking over, all through a near extinction event with significant inbreeding. So this is the epic storytelling, and these are the fairy tales that come out of the the evolutionist side. They have no explanation for that. Does that kind of make sense, Rebecca?
Yeah. So Pine Creek says inbreeding results in disease. Hello, Adam and Eve. So
yeah. I've had full debates on this.
Yeah.
And this is what happens when you don't read young earth creation technical literature. Okay, well, what have I said numerous times throughout this program? And I tried to break it down in an understandable way. We look to what's called the design diversity hypothesis. More technically, it's called the created heterozygosity hypothesis. Heterozygosity means a state of DNA diversity. Adam and Eve were created with no mutations. How would there be an inbreeding problem if there's no mutations to come to the forefront to lead to disease? Adam and Eve have no mutations. So yes, there would have been a few generations of inbreeding, and it has to be the case. That's necessary. But there wouldn't be any negative effects due to that inbreeding, because there's no mutations that are coming to the forefront to lead to disease and genetic degeneration. But Rebecca, and I challenge digital gnosis, here's the problem for the evolutionists. They explain the origin of all genetic variation as what? The result of mutations. They reject design diversity. They say all diversity was built up over mutations. Okay, so we have this population bottleneck, let's say 70,000 years ago. Typically when I debate evolutionists, that's the bottleneck they look to. And they look to what's called the Toba extinction, massive volcanic eruption, dropped the human population to between 2 and 10,000. Okay, whatever, let's stick with that. So now they have the inbreeding problem because they have millions of years of deleterious mutations that have built up and are now going to be revealed. You got this hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes that are now going to come to the forefront, leading to accelerated genetic damage. Where the creationists, we don't have that problem because we don't explain all genetic diversity as a result of mutations. Yes, some genetic diversity has been the result of mutations, some, but most actually has evidence for being created. That's why most of the genome is functional, essential, beneficial. And there are some deleterious mutations that have accumulated in the 6,000 years. So no, it's the inbreeding that is a problem for the evolutionists. Is that kind of an explanation that makes sense?
Perfect explanation. What about Andrew is complaining that we haven't talked about common ancestry. So do you want to talk about that a bit?
Well, common ancestry, if he's talking about universal common ancestry, it's been refuted by the fact that the mutation accumulation problem that we've been talking about puts shelf lives on genomes. So no, you don't have millions and millions of years of universal common descent taking, well, you'd probably start billions of years ago with your single self-replicating cell. So no, you don't have millions of years to evolve simple organisms to more complex organisms. And the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome DNA data that I have been providing demonstrates sufficiently that humans and chimpanzees are not related. Humans are actually not related to any other form of life. That confirms independent origins. So no, there is no universal ancestry, because we've already shown that humans cannot be related to any other form of life. Also, if we were to get into the age of the earth arguments outside of the genetic data, Rebecca, we could look to many lines of evidence that limit the age of Earth, age of the Earth. I'm just going to go over a couple really quick, because we could spend 3 hours on that. One example is comets. Okay, comets can't last very long. A comet is actually made up of ice and dirt, and they orbit the sun in an elliptical path. Now, I had an astrophysicist, Dr. Jason Lau, you're probably familiar with him, on my channel, going over all of these lines of evidence. So I recommend people check that out, because he's a genius at this topic. But he points out that when comets get close to the sun, that icy material gets blasted out into space. In other words, comets are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. They're losing mass. So it has been done. We can calculate the rate as to which these comets are being depleted. And comets cannot last millions of years. Okay. We've also got the rate at which we know the rate at which magnetic fields decay. And our magnetic field, the Earth's magnetic field, is decaying exponentially. And we can actually measure the decay of Earth's magnetic field. And if we were to run, Rebecca, Earth's magnetic field back even, let's say, 60,000 years ago, it would have been stronger than a neutron star, which is more than enough to rip the atoms of our bodies apart. So point is, the further you go back, the more problems you have for those that want to hold to deep time, because the magnetic field is going to be so strong, there's going to be massive problems to the point where there could not even be life on this planet. And all you have to do as well is look at the sedimentary layers that extend across entire continents. Okay, this is confirmation of the global flood in Genesis, because the cause of these sedimentary layers have to be global. In order to explain these incredibly massive layers, literally extending continents. We've also got fossils, billions of fossils all throughout these sedimentary layers. We've got marine fossils in landlocked areas that are far from the sea, far from the oceans. And when it comes to these layers, they had to be formed rapidly, because we wouldn't have billions of fossils in the first place to be stuck within these layers. So, I mean, there's a few lines of evidence from geology, we've talked about genetics, and from astronomy that limit the age of the Earth, limit the age of the universe. Because oftentimes what the theistic evolutionists, well, actually, no, there's old Earth proponents that'll say, well, okay, the genetic data places Adam and Eve within 6,000 years. We can't refute this. So they'll believe in what's called a young creation, the young creation of man, but an old universe, old Earth. Now, that's kind of inconsistent, because why would God need this universe that's billions of years old and then an Earth that's billions of years old to just bring about man 6,000 years ago? That's kind of inconsistent. But fine, if you want to give that to them, okay, now we can go to geology and astronomy and show you there.
Cool. And that's where I want to go, because Digital Gnosis says, does God just make the rocks look old as a test for the faithful? And I want to ask you about the two things that I often hear used, just the two main supports for the old age of the Earth, which, is distant starlight and radioisotope dating. So can you talk about those evidence that?
Yeah. So radioisotope dating and distant starlight. So those are two. I'll try and fit that in as best as I can. But I will point out that when they say, is God deceitful? Did he just make the universe look old? Like, if I picked up a rock, how old does it look to somebody? I don't have a rock next to me, unfortunately. But when you pick that up and you say, well, that looks old, you're actually making an assumption based on the fact that, or based on the idea that we would have another Earth and another universe, or we'd have another proxy to even compare our Earth and universe to. We only have one universe. We only have one Earth. So to me, the universe looks decayed and young. The Earth looks eroded but young. We don't have another Earth and universe to compare it to. So God, according to the Bible, created a functionally mature universe and Earth. When Adam was created, if scientists would have come to Adam, let's say, I don't know, an hour after creation, and they would have looked at his height, his weight, they would have done some genetic sequencing tests, they would conclude, okay, this guy is, he's been around for, let's say, 25 years. According to his genetics, he's had past common ancestors, because his genetics would then reflect having a father and a mother. But no, he was created directly by God. So that would actually be a false assumption, because Adam could not have been created as a zygote. He had to be created in a state where he could work the garden. Point is, if you ask Adam, how old does he look? He'd have no other proxy. See, we have seen people be born. We've seen them grow to adulthood. We've seen them pass away at 80, 90. We have a proxy to tell. But we don't have another universe to look at. We don't have another Earth to look at. This is actually fallacious. It's a logical fallacy. So I just wanted to kind of get that out of the way. Adam wouldn't know. He wouldn't have another proxy to know what a 30-year-old looks like, what a 60-year-old looks like. So he couldn't really make that judgment. Does that kind of make sense before I move into the dating methods? Okay. Okay, perfect. Because it's just, I want to get that fallacy out of the way. So when it comes to the dating methods, that is where we were going to go earlier, actually. So I'll screen share. We'll do the distant starlight one the last. We'll definitely deal with that and make this as thorough as possible. But here's a chart that I have of rocks of known age. Okay, so we have rocks of known age that we've tested. And the dates that we get are in huge error. They're vastly different than, so for example, here is the known age of certain rocks that formed. Okay, rock sample, place of origin. Let's do one here. Volcano in Hawaii. Known age 200 years. They dated the rock. Look at the date they got: 160 million to 2.96 billion years. These are the dates being derived from rocks of known age. We know when these rocks were formed. Here's another one: 200 years. We got 140 million to 670 million years ago. One here, 19. Now these are found in the secular literature. These aren't just young Earth creationists making this up. So point is, when it comes to dating methods, as you can see here, why would we trust the dates derived from rocks of unknown age when we can't even accurately derive dates from rocks of known age? Okay, so there are some huge assumptions at play when it comes to these dating methods. And a couple of those assumptions has to do with the decay. And has the decay rate always been constant? Well, we've actually shown in the lab now that decay rates can be sped up significantly. And young Earth creationists would say, for the most part, that during the flood or creation event, there was some rapid decay due to the heat and pressure during the flood, the catastrophic effects of the flood. But the easiest way, Rebecca, to just destroy this idea of dating methods is to point out the fact that carbon dating, radiocarbon, is pretty well the best friend of young Earth creationists, because we find carbon. And here's the thing: when it comes to carbon-14, there should be no carbon-14 based on how quickly it decays in any samples millions, over 1 million years old, or let's say with diamonds, billions of years old. Because for the audience sake who doesn't understand, I guess, the process, carbon decays so quickly that let's say every single atom in the universe was made of carbon. It would all decay within 1 million years easily. So when we test rocks or fossils or diamonds that the evolutionists say are millions to billions of years old, we shouldn't find any radiocarbon in them, right? I hope that makes sense. Yeah. It should have all decayed away, essentially. And we have many PhD scientists that made up a group called the rate group, radioisotopes in the age of the Earth. Okay, so this is a team made up of numerous PhDs, and what they did is they sent all sorts of samples for testing. samples ranging from tens of millions of years to billions of years old when it comes to the diamonds. And what they got was radiocarbon, okay, detectable levels of radiocarbon in every single sample. Now, the rescue devices that have been used don't work either. Oftentimes they'll say, these were contaminated, which is ridiculous because these high level laboratories, they know how to subject these samples to harsh treatments and bleach them to the point where we're looking at blank samples. So no, contamination has been looked at. And yet these results with radiocarbon are repeatable. And we repeatedly find radiocarbon in dinosaur bones, fossils, coal, fossilized wood, diamonds. Shouldn't be there. Shouldn't be there if the Earth is billions of years old. That's just one line of evidence.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. But of course we have the discoveries in the dinosaur bones, the tissue in the dinosaur bones that's supposedly millions of years old and preserved for that long.
That's right. That's right. I might as well leave no stone unturned. So the most advanced rebuttal that you'll get to the C14, and a debate that I highly recommend, it took place recently within the last year, is between Dr. Hugh Ross, who's a strong proponent of old Earth creation, and Dr. Jason Lisle. They debated this topic, and they got into the radiocarbon argument. And Dr. Hugh Ross brought up the argument where he said that there would be other nuclear material down where, let's say, diamonds, because diamonds are the hardest substance of Earth, on Earth, and they should be the most resistant to contamination. So let's look at diamonds. Why is there C14 in diamonds? Well, they'll say, and Hugh Ross said, that there's other nuclear material down where the diamonds are that can recharge the C14. and this would technically be the best they can offer, right? But it's so funny because this has also been looked into, and what they estimated, Rebecca, is that you would need 13,000 times more nuclear material in the nearby rocks in order to adequately recharge the C14. In other words, you would need far too much material to recharge, and I'm talking unrealistic amounts that would have to be deep down in the Earth, where, as we know, cosmic rays cannot reach deep within the Earth. So that C14 should just decay away. So that's their main rescue devices, and they haven't worked. There hasn't been a good rebuttal to it, Rebecca.
Okay, so then, the only thing that they've responded to with regard to the diamonds, okay, so there's the recharging idea, and then there's the idea that there was contamination in the experiment. But both of these have shown, to be impossible. So, is there any other explanation being proposed?
Contamination, the fact that nearby material could recharge the C14. And I've heard the argument that maybe it's just residual radiocarbon, but that doesn't work either, because I've got papers showing that it's sometimes 100 times over the detectable limit. So it's not just residual. Really, they don't. I mean, there are very technical papers coming out from the young Earth creation literature addressing all of this. And I've had Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, who's a PhD chemist. Professor David McQueen is our team geologist. So we've had shows fully dedicated to this with experts on the topic too, that are going to know a lot more than I do on this specific topic. So for anyone in the audience that is still not convinced, I would suggest you check those videos out. And if you think that you do have a rebuttal, then feel free to send in a response. We'd be happy to respond to it. But I haven't seen any convincing arguments, and the best that I've seen have been dealt with.
And it's also, I think, worth mentioning that the presence of coal and oil all over the world is good evidence for the flood. That at one time, a large amount of biological material was buried, and so, this is not only just the presence of carbon-14, that kind of shows that the coal and the oil is not millions of years old. We have that, but it's also, what we might expect if all of the life that was on Earth was buried rapidly.
Amen. If I could say one thing to that, because that's such a great point, Rebecca, is the fact that there's actually been really, really fascinating research into the rapid production of oil and coal, like you're talking about, as in like in real time laboratory experiments, we're seeing natural gas, coal, and oil being produced in a matter of days when it comes to coal to weeks. Okay. And in these tests, we're finding that you can produce coal and oil quickly in a process that requires a lot of heat, energy, and pressure. And these tests have actually demonstrated that with more heat, you'll get a faster production of coal, oil, and natural gas. So point is, we find, as you're pointing out, that these massive deposits of coal and oil all over the planet, that the evolutionists, uniformitarians would say, oh, there's no way to account for that in a young Earth time scale or a young Earth creation model. But it's so funny, and I don't know, you may have heard of this. One of these main objections to the global flood model is that the global flood would have resulted in far too much heat. Okay, that it would have boiled the ocean, it would have melted the crust, it would have essentially killed Noah, killed the ark animals. But what we're now finding is this heat and energy produced by the flood, the natural result of a global flood, is actually a feature and not a bug, because, as I'm pointing out, you can get the rapid production of natural oil, gas, and coal with heat. So if you have all this heat during the flood, then we can easily explain the massive deposits of coal and oil as being the result of a global flood. And the heat and energy produced during the global flood would help explain the massive and rapid production of natural oil, gas, and coal. And this is what I typically say is the pre-flood world being 90% green. I mean, just look at some of the fauna, look at some of the animals, how big they were. The pre-flood world would have been this perfect battery that could have absorbed or sucked up a lot of this heat that was produced at the flood and utilized it for things like this, natural gas and oil, or been utilized to rapidly move plates, because we believe in essentially continental sprint during the flood. And you need continental sprint. You need meters per second movements of the plates in order to explain the geological features of the Earth today. Because what we see today, these uniformitarian processes, Rebecca, we see snail-paced movements of the plates. You're not going to get the necessary kind of buckling to rapidly uplift rock strata to create these mountains unless you're looking at meters per second plate movements that can rapidly buckle the strata, uplifting these mountains and these geological features that we see. So uniformitarian processes, in other words, can't explain what we actually see in terms of the features of the Earth. So I like that you brought up that point.
Cool. What about the distant starlight issue?
I'm going to need another coffee for this one. Just kidding. Yeah, that is probably their last go-to one, right? And you've heard it before. First off, I'm just going to recommend that people go check out. So I did an interview with, as I pointed out earlier, maybe you watched, Dr. Jason Lisle. So he's a PhD astrophysicist, and he's done an incredible amount of work. He's a young Earth creationist. He's done an incredible amount of work on this so-called distant starlight problem. So I had him on, and I actually emailed some critics, and I said, send me in your best objections to his specific model dealing with distant starlight. And they did. So we had an hour-and-a-half show, and I presented him the best so-called objections, the most technical objections you can think of, and he demolished them. So I highly recommend checking that video out if you think distant starlight is an issue. But what I'll say in a nutshell, in the best way I understand his model, because it does require an advanced knowledge in the physics of Einstein, okay? And he's actually written specifically a book dealing with the physics of Einstein for people who are interested. So the best way to explain it is the fact that what we know and what Einstein would agree with is that time can flow at different rates. And this basically, Rebecca, comes down to this question: how do we synchronize clocks over long distances, okay? And by long distances, I don't mean like from me to you. on this earth. Well, I'm talking about us having a friend, hypothetically, who's on Mars, and we want to give him a call at noon, let's say. How do we know that his noon is my noon? And therefore, how exactly do we synchronize these clocks, right? Well, the answer, and believe it or not, is, and this is completely consistent with the physics of Einstein. This isn't pseudoscience or anything like that. This doesn't require any miracles at all, but there's actually no objective way to synchronize clocks, to measure the two-way speed of light. And what this means is that the one-way speed of light becomes somewhat subjective. And the way Dr. Jason Lisle explains it is that when light is coming towards an observer, okay, let's say light's coming towards us, or light's coming towards Adam and Eve at the creation event, it can arrive instantaneously. As in, the stars we're seeing, the galaxies we're seeing in real time. And I know this sounds counterintuitive and it's almost hard to comprehend, but it's all perfectly consistent with physics, with science. Now, light traveling away from us, going away from an observer, that can take a lot longer, obviously, than being instantaneous. All we need is one-way, the one-way speed of light coming towards us to be instantaneous. And this is the way, actually, the ancients understood it. And I think this is the way that they understood it in the Bible. I think this is the convention that God was using in the Bible, because these lights would have had to be seen from the stars for what they were created for, the function of them, instantaneously for Adam and Eve. So yeah, when we look out in the universe and we look at the most distant star, the most distant galaxy, guess what? We're seeing it in real time. That light has hit our eyes instantaneously. And to some people, that sounds hard to understand, hard to believe. And I just recommend checking out Dr. Jason Lisle's work on it. Or watch that debate I recommended, Hugh Ross versus Jason Lisle, Rebecca. They get into this distant starlight issue. And how do I say it in a nice way? Hugh Ross didn't do too well against Jason Lisle on that topic, because Jason Lisle really has figured this out. And it's a really, really strong explanation, I think. So in other words, there's no distant starlight problem. I hope that kind of made sense.
Yeah, well, I think like for me, and we may disagree on this, I'm not sure, but I did hear Jason Lisle responding to Hugh Ross one time regarding like evidences for the age of the earth. And he said, look, we do see some things that would point to that would make us assume that the earth is old, but we also see like some evidence that the earth is young. And that's kind of where I am, where I see distant starlight as a problem. I see it as a problem has the potential to be resolved. Right. And actually there's other problems like Dr. Lisle talks about the problems with the evolutionary model, and that there's like an equivalent of the distant starlight problem regarding the heat transfer in the universe. And also like, in order to keep this whole model working, we're assuming dark matter and dark energy.
Right.
And so like, there's like evidences on both sides. So like when I'm thinking, why do I believe in young earth creation? It's not because I think all the evidence supports young earth creation. I think there's some evidence against it, but I do think, like you've talked about today, there's, a lot of evidence for a young earth. So that's just the scientific evidence, and there's some on both sides. But when I read the Bible, the story that I read, I have a very hard time putting in millions of years and evolution and billions. I mean, if we're going by the model of the universe, then billions. Which, I mean, actually the billions of years for the universe, I mean, that's not really a problem. But like when you get into millions of years of animal suffering and millions of years of development of, uh, ancestors to humans, that to me does not fit into the biblical text. And so but the young earth thing is kind of a separate thing from evolution for me. I am completely I have been convinced that there is no good scientific evidence for evolution. So now that's like kind of a separate issue for me, where I will be very strong against evolution, where I would, still admit on the young earth side that, hey, there's evidence for both young and older. So how do you think about that?
No, I think that's great. I think you make a lot of good points there, and I think it comes down to this. And this is a clip I have on my channel with Jason Lyle and Hugh Ross, and I think it fits perfectly with what you said. Is that if scientists were to come to Adam an hour after he's created, he did all these tests. Well, they're going to determine by his height, his weight, through genetic sequencing that he's old. But then they're going to look at maybe some blood tests, his cholesterol levels. They can check his skin. They're going to find that there's no evidence. There's only evidence for youth in his skin because he was just born. So in other words, what they're going to find, these scientists, are evidence that Adam is old and evidence that Adam is young. But it's the evidence that Adam is young that actually overturns the evidence that he's old. Because as long as you have one really strong, sufficient line of evidence that the earth cannot be older than whatever, with carbon dating, the earth cannot be older than 1 million years. Well, then there's no evolution. Or the magnetic field, the earth cannot be older than 60,000 years, right? These are like the blood tests of Adam, where these blood tests, there's no other way to explain it. I mean, these blood tests confirm that Adam was just created an hour ago, regardless of the fact that he weighs 160 pounds or his height is 6 foot whatever, even though today we understand that someone who's 6 feet or 160 pounds is not a newborn baby. In the same way that with Adam, it would be wrong to assume that he had years and years to grow to that point. It's the lines of evidence that, wow, these blood tests really confirm he was created just an hour ago. Also, somebody in the chat, Digital Gnosis. So I want to point this out. And this is why I explain, and Dr. Lyle always explains this too when it comes to this model, is it sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually perfectly consistent with the physics of Einstein. Einstein would agree with this, and anybody who understands the physics of Einstein would agree with the fact that depending on what convention you're using, and this is the way all the ancient cultures did it and viewed it, then from that convention, light takes no time at all to reach my eyes. It's literally instantaneous. Light incoming can be as fast as infinity, and light outgoing can be different. So yeah, if we're using that convention, we are looking at distant stars and distant galaxies in real time. And I understand it sounds counterintuitive and it's complicated, but it's all scientific and understood to those who understand the physics of Einstein. And Dr. Lyle actually challenged Dr. Hugh Ross in that debate to provide rebuttals to this model in written form. And Dr. Lyle would respond, and Dr. Ross, who is a brother in Christ, I love Hugh Ross, I just think he's wrong on the age of the earth, but he does reject universal common ancestry. He has not yet responded with those rebuttals. Now, here's one last thing I want to point out, Rebecca, and I know we're coming at the 2-hour mark here, so I'll start winding down. There's just so much to say. There is one other model that I find interesting, and this is a model that I've argued for in the past, and it has to do with Dr. Russell Humphreys. And it's called gravitational time dilation. I'm not sure if you have looked into this at all, but what it suggests is that God may have created stars and galaxies while Earth itself was deep inside a gravitational time well. Now, this would have to assume that Earth was created at the center of mass, or at or near the center of the universe. But we actually have evidence that may be the case. So that assumption has actually kind of been validated. But anyways, what this would do is it would actually cause Earth clocks to slow down or completely stop. Think of like a tent. If you had a tent and then you threw a bowling ball in the middle of the tent, it would sink right to the bottom. And that would be where your time dilation is occurring the most. So if Earth is created at the center of mass, it would be deep within this time well. So from the Bible, the biblical perspective, God would stretch out the heavens, which we read over and over again. God stretches out the heavens. Well, what's going to come out first? What's going to come out last? The Earth would come out last of that gravitational time well, and the stars and galaxies would be stretched out and come out first. So they would have very little time dilation, and the Earth would have experienced a lot of time dilation. So in other words, the Earth could be 6,000 years, and the stars and galaxies would appear older. So from Earth's perspective, it really would be, 6,000 years. So that's another complicated model. It's an interesting model. Mm-hmm. I tend to lean more towards Dr. Jason Lisle's model, but there is strong evidence for Dr. Russell Humphrey's model. But the point to take from it is there are different models that are all pretty strong, and no model is perfect, but there are young Earth creationists working on this issue. And those are the two models that I think are personally the best, but I do kind of lean more towards Jason Lisle's model. Go ahead.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for, being here and sharing just the work and everything that you've been doing. And for those who joined late, before I ask your final question, I just want to say, please do go subscribe to Standing for Truth. And I put links to his website and and his channels in the discussion section. So please do that. And I just want to ask you, what do you want people to know about Jesus Christ?
Good question. So, and I think we're in agreement here too, in that we can win arguments all day. But it's about winning souls. If we're not winning souls, the Bible says he that winneth souls is wise. So you can be right on everything and yet wrong on the gospel, and you will die in an unregenerate state. So what I want people to know, and I want people to, if you're not saved yet, then go read the Gospel of John or talk to Rebecca or myself, and we'll be more than happy to lead you to Christ. Put your faith and trust on Christ and his finished work alone. He paid it all. Okay, we can't work to be saved. We can't work to stay saved. Jesus Christ paid it all. And you can be a young Earth creationist and write on all the science and not have all your faith on Jesus Christ and his finished work. And as I said earlier, you're going to die in an unregenerate state. Or you can have an old Earth creationist who's right on the gospel and wrong on what I believe is the science. But the fact that they're putting their whole faith and trust on Jesus Christ, they're regenerated, they're saved. Mm-hmm. So that's what I want people to know about Jesus Christ, is that, and the Gospel of John is the book written that we may be saved. Go read that, and you'll read over and over again, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish but have everlasting life. So if you're not yet saved, then what are you waiting for? Because eternity is a long time. Okay, and we're all going to die. That's inevitable. So just make sure you put your whole faith and trust on Christ and Christ alone. So
cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I appreciate everybody who has been here in the chat. And I know that some of these ideas are just, they're very counter to the way that we've been educated. But I really do hope that people will consider the evidence and not just believe what you've been taught. And so, it really is about critical thinking. And there's been a lot of people in the chat kind of, insulting and in calling this like stupid and ridiculous.
We're used to it.
Yeah, exactly.
I thrive on it, actually. I love it. I get 100 comments a day from atheists, scoffers, and haters. And you know what? It increases my power level, actually. It makes me want to do this. It motivates me. So, bring on the insults and the, but here's the thing. where's the rebuttals? Where's the arguments? Where's the objections? Insult and ad hominems, they're not going to do much to, improve this controversy and the dialogue surrounding it. So,
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Standing for Truth. Bye, everybody.
bye. God bless. God bless.